All right, everybody, welcome to Progressive Farming, episode 11, Composting 101. Excited to have everybody here today, and I hope you enjoy the show. You can head to tv.permethos.com if you want to find past episodes, and learn.permethos.com if you want to support the show. We do this totally free, and we just ask $29 a year if you like what you're learning and want more. With that, thank you, Evan, and take over, man.
Dig it. Thank you, Josiah. I just reinforce his little message there. I appreciate everybody's support out there. This is a passion of mine, and this talk is actually kind of the fulcrum. This little moment here. Last couple weeks ago now, we did the soil food web primer, and we're going to talk composting today. And we're going to get into compost tea for a couple of weeks following this. And it's, the microbe defines soil, period. As I like to describe it, try drinking a beer without yeast. It's I say it a lot, but it cuts right to the point. And for people that enjoy their beverages, it makes microbes really important really fast. Because the reality is it would be some sugar water if the yeast weren't involved. They biologically transmutate the materials into plant food or people food, or whatever the process is that they are undertaking. And part of what comes out of that statement as well is the microbes that would make alcohol and beer are not the same as soil microbes, and they're not the same as gut microbes that would make manure, for example. Or any sort of process of which you wanted to articulate a mode of action for microorganisms. So one of the things that happens is really two things. One is an assumption that the microbes that are responsible for performing a process, are there to begin with, which is not the case typically. And another is, because of the nuance in regards to what complex of microbes are required to perform a function isn't defined in some very rigid way that can be referred to in a textbook, the term microbe tends to get clumped together in general. And you lose the power of the nuance, which in the biological microbial world particularly are the point. It's been estimated we know 5% of bacteria and 10% of fungi at the rate of discovery, which means we basically know nothing about what we're trying to look at in the soil. And it dilutes the power of the authority of a lot of the biological testing on the market, which is not DNA based. It wouldn't be cost effective for it to be approached in that way anyway. But back to the 5 to 10% estimated discovery statement, the ability to gain authority within that approach is very limited. So it creates an undeniable gray area of, well, how do we work with microbes? And the best way that I know how is to source naturally diverse humus sources. It's not really possible to choose the microbes required to perform the act of composting in all of its potential and glory individually. It'd be like trying to make the lake into an ocean by bringing in parts. There's a lot more to it than that. So it doesn't have to complicate things. It really just means, source some worm castings and some forest floor humus and, products on the market that are designed to be diverse beyond our ability to measure. And what you get is all the residual benefit of what we do know and the residual benefit of what we don't know. And that's really the magic of the food web. So a visual of that is, we looked at this previously. It's just a flow chart of, the leaves falling, the primary decomposers, and consumers, as they're called on this graphic, being the fungi and bacteria, kind of the front lines that are chemically decomposing the organic matter into its lowest decomposed state, which is called humus. And then the secondary consumers or cyclers eat them, and then the macroorganisms that we can see with our eyes that we tend to have respect for, but because we can see them, eat them. And big fish eats the little fish, right? That analogy of paralleling it to the ocean really works, because most people are familiar with the importance of plankton in the ocean, maybe even just because whales eat it, right? But if we took the plankton out of the ocean, everything dies. And that's a bit of what we're dealing with in our farms and our gardens, is we've got an inert soil to the potential of diversity that it should be, to be a natural living system that's cycling nutrition properly. And what we're paying attention to is only what we can see. An anecdote from my time as a garden store owner, people would come in asking to buy worms to put them in their garden, which is not necessarily wrong, but they hadn't thought past what they couldn't see, and the reality is the worms introduced into an inert garden, or a chemically treated garden for that matter, are going to run for the hills. They are mobile, unlike microbes that might move a micrometer in their lifetime. But if you put them into a scenario where there's not an abundance of the plankton, if you will, then they're going to go looking for greener pastures. So the best way to attract worms and arthropods and some of those macrocyclers that you might be able to see is to get the micro food web diverse and cycling properly. And then the worms come because they're able to. And then the birds come to get them, and the ecosystem is built. So that mental image is really, really important to get a lot of leverage in the micro world, particularly if you don't have a microscope and you can't see it directly to appreciate it. So, here's another schematic, and, it'd be impossible to put all the players into an actual view in this capacity, but you kind of get the idea that, the forest trees don't eat the leaves, they eat what the microbes, bacteria, and fungi make out of it. Actinomycetes are an organism in the food web. There tend to be a bridge between the bacteria and fungi, have more in common with bacteria than fungi. But the further you try to detail nice, neat categories for these alien organisms, if you will, the clearer it becomes that our ability to compartmentalize nature is not really going to be a very successful endeavor. So I say all that to say that there's an admitted gray area here, and that shouldn't dissuade our focus on it. In my opinion and experience, it's even more important to focus on it at that point, because it's unavoidable. It's not possible to fertilize soil into health. That's a fertilizer is a crutch, right? And it's needed because the system can't sustain the growth that we're asking from it. Simple as that. And in a lot of context, agriculturally speaking, depending on where you're growing, it's not possible to do that for a very long time. If you've got a sandy soil condition and your exchange capacity is a 5, 6, 7, somewhere in that range, you pretty much have to fertilize, because the soil is incapable of holding the volume of material that the ecosystem is asking from it. So these are a lot of things that I learned from and explore in our fertility management services that do water and soil testing. And it gives us a really intimate, remote view of the farm. And we do a physicality test that tells us sand, clay, organic matter. We do a pace test that shows you solubility compared to the basic testing, which looks for 22 individual elements, which is beyond the scope of essential nutrition, but about as far as we can go without breaking the bank. So our services are around $300. They're completely economical to the value that they bring, and it allows us to learn vicariously through people's agricultural efforts in learning how products work in different applications based on different data sets. It's kind of a never-ending process. I'm very comfortable with the idea that I'm not going to be able to figure it all out, which is kind of the draw of it for me. Everyone is different. It's kind of a new project. But painting these pictures and bringing these types of analogies that I try to do are really a result of me spending 15 years engaging the general public on these concepts. And it really is important to try to simplify it. So I do take efforts to do that. Sometimes I'm not very successful. I'm told sometimes I talk over people, and I don't mean to do that. And I'm not claiming to know more than you in that capacity. I guess you're limited somewhat by the way you communicate. So feel free to ask any questions that you might have as we go through this information. But this is a pretty powerful image. When people ask what is compost tea, what I typically do is kind of take a couple steps back and paint a picture and say, look, when the trees fall in the forest, the microbes don't eat what falls on the ground. They eat the plant trees. Don't eat what falls on the ground. They eat what the microbes make out of it. That is what we call composting, what we're going to talk about today. That concentrates a natural process for human benefit. That's a lot of what composting is, because the act of composting is happening and should happen everywhere in nature. The fact that it's not, by default, is human influence. and adulteration. Frankly, there's no other way to describe it. We've affected the living system's ability to produce in the way that it can. So it's in our interest, rather than just taking advantage of that into perpetuity, which is basically what we've done since the beginning of the industrial agriculture at the beginning of the 20th century there, is we've taken advantage of our topsoils. And what we found is if you look around the world and you look at the agricultural centers that didn't have the topsoil to abuse to begin with, they're much further along in these types of conversations that we are. Australia and Israel would be two that jump out at me. You know, they're very hip to biodynamics. They're talking the biological language. They've exhausted their ability to take their soil for granted, and they're looking to the things that are now working in that environment and context to move forward. And they're practicing regenerative agriculture, which is what agriculture should be. So round and round we go. It hasn't been, because we've had this tremendous ability in the United States to take advantage of this topsoil. But what I see happening, and it's increasing exponentially, is farmers that have been doing the same thing for a long, long time, running out of resources to control the issues that they've created. And also at the same time coming to terms with the fact that they've created them. It takes an element of humility, to not, realize that we're our own worst enemy is kind of our own worst enemy in some ways of looking at it. So that being said, when you evaluate the leaves falling and the microbes in the soil making plant food, and you look at a giant sequoia like this and you say, well, how the heck did the soil grow that plant without any fertilizer? The answer is in the strength and the maturity and diversity of the microbes in the soil. So, is it possible to get to forest level fertility in a reasonable amount of time on a farm? Maybe not. It doesn't mean that a focus on that ideal is not moving us in the directions that we want to be taking. And I think, my statement that I would stand on is that you would be amazed at the level of power and cost mitigation you can accomplish over time by focusing on microbes. One way of saying that is organic farming is really about feeding microbes, period. It's become a lot more than that in most people's minds, but that's what it really boils down to. But the microbes have to be there to be fed. And for me, that is an easy segue towards what agriculture is and isn't, towards the conversation that we're going to have today about composting. Is, people are going through the motions. I saw this on a daily, weekly basis in my garden store over 15 years. As people coming in with a compost pile, and we'd ask them, you got a compost pile? They say, yeah. I normally say, well, let me take a guess. It's not really working the way that you want it to, right? And then they kind of look at me like, well, how'd you know? And the reason is the last 100 people before them didn't have it figured out either. So it didn't become difficult to kind of pierce that veil. And, what we found is that really all it took was a 5-minute conversation to orient them to the fact that microbes actually do the composting to begin with, right? And I was telling Josiah before we got on the call, do a quick Google search of how to compost and read the first 5 links that come from authority figures like in the extension service realm. And the reality is the word microorganism or microbe is not used at all. It's basically blacklisted, I think passively more than any kind of attention. But the lack of focus on microbes and composting really is 99% of the issues that I've ever seen. And I may take a step back from that statement to say carbon to nitrogen ratio can also be something that works against the success of composting. And that's basically, in my evaluation, the only real conscious element involved in composting, when humans put together organic matter for the purpose of biological decomposition. So that being said, I wanted to introduce you to a couple of videos that my wife has a production company and did these videos for us on some of our products. And I think it's an apt way of getting across the philosophy that we bring to product development, not for just the sake of making products, but really as a resource or a mother for diverse microbes, and primarily in brewing compost tea. And one of the things that we did over the years, over and over and over, was, somebody had a compost pile. It's not heating up. It's not cycling to their expectation. We troubleshoot some things, give them some compost tea in the brewer that we had running in the store. And in many cases, people would go home and just pour the gallon of living microbes on their compost. And someone would call us the next day and say, you wouldn't believe it, but the pile lost half its volume and it's billowing heat and something's happening now, right? And it's literally the fact that the life that was responsible to, collectively decompose this organic matter into humus or perfect plant food just wasn't physically there. So adding that inoculant, diverse inoculant, brought the construction workers, and to continue the analogy that I like to use about microbes, and are now able to put the neighborhood together and finish the process of breaking everything down so that it can be built back up in regards to how plants seek nutrition. So this is Earth Compound. Just give you a little taste of this. Earth Compound is a premium handcrafted microbial inoculant for brewing compost tea. This stuff is powerful, so a little goes a long way. There are literally trillions of microbes in Earth Compound, with countless diversity. Formulated with multiple forms of organic and biodynamic farm compost, grain-fed worm castings, archaea microbes, and potentized with the biodynamic preparations.
Okay, don't freak out. I just used some big words there. Odds are you're a millennial. Google that.
Most microbes found in gardening products were cultured in the lab. They grow up with no competition. It makes them lazy. They have no life experience. But the microbes in Earth Compound come directly from Mother Nature. They grew up in the real world, learning from their mistakes, and they're ready to revolutionize your garden.
You in?
So we try to kind of keep it short and sweet, which is the way to make videos these days because of our lack of attention span. But I wanted to flesh out a couple of ideas there. One is to focus on diversity from multiple sources of naturally derived microbial products. Worm castings, archaea is more of an isolate, but we've found that higher populations of them in our inoculant increase performance measurably. And then the biodynamic and organic farm compost from different farms that are made based on the biodynamic principles and the biodynamics, which we'll talk about in the future. And the organic farm compost because it needs to be certified for us to be able to work with organic growers, but also because their cultivation practices and general practices, farming practices are conducive to a greater diversity of microbes in the material. So our effort is to bring together as many different diverse sources as possible. Diversity wins the day, period. It's not about picking certain ones. That only makes sense and does make sense agriculturally when you're looking for a specific mode of action, and that is accomplished by the concentration of the individual microbes you brought together. Make the connection that the population by volume of a selected for biological product is out of balance of what nature would produce on her own. Nature works through balance, period. So if you have a disease organism that rears its head in nature, it immediately gets balanced out by the rest of the team. So to bring higher amounts of those microbes that might do the balancing can be more effective if you have a disease that's active, for example. But if you're introducing a balanced food web consistently over time and establishing your fertility and microbial presence from a stance of diversity, the disease doesn't have a chance to rear its head to begin with. Now, that's somewhat of an ideal because if agriculture innately is a disruptive process. If you're bringing in plants that say grow in a tropical environment and trying to grow them in higher latitudes, you're going to get an environmental disconnect that may not mitigate disease in that general capacity. But that being said, it's definitely not going to hurt. So what I don't want to do is denigrate individually selected biological products. What I'd like to do is create a mindset that both are valuable but need to be applied accordingly. If you're using a selected for biological product as a food web inoculant, you're not getting the result that you would want. And vice versa, if you're using a balanced compost tea for an active disease outbreak for a plant that's not endemic to that environmental condition, then you may not be able to gain the type of control in the disease that you want. So you got to play it all by ear. The important part is to be able to think through the application in a way that gives us all the result that we want. So Earth Compound is made in that capacity. You could use that to add it straight to a compost pile if you wanted to passively, or just stir it up in a bucket and water it right in. When you're using compost tea on land that's degenerated, you typically have to be a lot more consistent with your applications. And composting, you can do it once because everything in the pile is of utmost potential. If you're using it, I keep pointing out my window because our soil sucks, but it's giving me a good thing to think about as I'm talking through this. If you're bringing diverse microbes to a degenerated situation, it's, again, it's like a virgin land on a construction site. You got to bring them back consistently to be able to create the conditions that allow the microbes to thrive on their own. So the compost tea conversation is a lot more consistency of application, whereas when you're composting, you can add the microbes once, and as long as you don't clean the bin out or move it or start over in some capacity, and you can leave a couple gallons of what you finished for the next batch as a mother, in concept, you don't need to re-inoculate the pile over and over. Now, having said that, there is some benefit in doing that, predominantly, especially if you're brewing teas, because you're brewing the microbes beyond the concentration that nature could do on her own. You're increasing the population by idealizing the conditions. And so having that higher population of microbes in that solution can absolutely speed the process of the composting up, simply because you're bringing a higher population of reinforcements that nature couldn't do on her own. So it speeds the process up. It doesn't define whether it works or not. What defines whether it works or not is whether it's inoculated to begin with. And unfortunately, well, I guess on some levels, fortunately, our food doesn't have the microbial diversity that soil wants and that composting wants. And it's not in our landscapes to begin with, based on property development most times. So it just gets back to that original statement of, you can't assume the microbes required to undertake your process are there to begin with. The only way to know is to add them deliberately. So with that understanding, we can talk about some of the particulars of composting. I made this statement earlier. It's a concentration of nature for human benefit, and by that metric, we need more of it in every way. Our agriculture is dominated by conventionality. These 1% to 2% of farms are organic at this point, certifiably. The rest are completely conventional. So we got a lot of work to do. The food web, in a lot of respects, in the same way as medicine, the future of agriculture is biological. I would add on to that energetic. And I'm in some high-level conversations with some global companies that have attention towards creating vibrational metrics in their products. You can think biodynamic methods, things like that. I call it bioenergetic agriculture. And all it does is just bring energy into the conversation. It needs to be there from the get-go, because life is defined by energy. No matter how much woo-woo you might hear from someone talking about biodynamic methods or bioenergetics, the reality is life is energy, period. So we'll get into that in some detail in the future, but the compost pile is the gut of the landscape. It's a really easy way to simplify the relevance of microbes. As I'm sure you're aware, we can't live without microbes in and on our bodies. And if we do, we're tremendously sick from it. And we're only now starting to figure out, with some renewed focus on these connections, of why that is. And unfortunately, it hadn't reached the textbook and the common sense yet, but it's coming really, really fast. So, as far as simplifying this in our conversations in our minds, the compost pile is the gut of the landscape. The parallels are life. It really does simplify it. So there's a lot of reasons to compost. You're probably familiar with a lot of these. It improves soil structure. One of the cool things about adding humus is that regardless of whether you have a sand or clay posture in your soil type, you want to add organic matter, and in concert with diverse microbes. And you do that because humus is plant food. You do that because it holds more water. You do that because clay, in terms of the exchange capacity, which we covered in the mineral conversation a month or so ago, is electrical. Opposites attract. Clay is a negatively charged substance. Organic matter has both positive and negative. So rather than just talk about the cation exchange capacity, we can introduce the concept of the anionic exchange capacity, which is not really measured. We invented a measurement actually internally that we brought to market with our fertility management services, but there's nowhere that can measure that from a lab-based stance at this point that I'm aware of. If you are aware of it, I'd love to know about it. But to the point, organic matter is a lot more flexible and nuanced and has the ability to hold both positive and negative elements. If you've got a really heavy clay, you can have a huge exchange capacity and the ability to hold most elements, but phosphorus and sulfur and boron are going to be deficient typically because there's no positively charged entity in the soil to hold it in the soil, which is really, if you kind of boil this down one more level, why we fertilize. A lot of the times we're just overcompensating to grow the plant because we don't know how to manage the soil properly. So again, that's a lot of the work that we do. So we got farmers calling us to decrease the amount of water that they're using. A lot of these farms on scale, the biggest line item they have is water. especially in the Midwest and some in the West where water rights are a real issue. You're going to mitigate a lot of the pest and disease issues that are born. I'm working with Africa right now on their armyworm problem, and they have a pupal stage, a larval stage through the soil that's mitigated by beneficial nematodes. So the conversation is around, well, do we bring the nematodes to have to use them every year, which would probably be a cost-effective benefit for how much crops issues they're having and the amount of money that they're hemorrhaging over there for this issue, or is it more efficacious to bring the food web, maybe the nematodes up front and then the food web to follow, so that we don't need to continue to do the nematode input. But the bottom line is, the healthy soil is going to mitigate basically any issue that has a mode of action through the soil itself. You could take fleas for that matter, or chinch bug, mole cricket, fire ants. All of these organisms that take root in the soil aren't contamination and bad luck. They're really born of being advantageous towards an inert system, or an incapacitated or imbalanced or deficient system. So it does help with pest and disease. And a lot of people compost just to divert their organic waste because they're conscious of not putting things in the landfill, and that's totally fine. There's a lot of people that do that. So the key is to make sure that we have the type of success performing the process as we do from our expectation of the intentions that we're undertaking. And that's where this information does become valuable. So really simple flow chart. You've got the organic waste. It goes in through the process. The microbes work on it in combination with water and air and release carbon dioxide. There are methods to evaluate compost. One of the questions that comes up is, how do I know when it's finished? Well, one, you can look at it. If you can't read the words on the piece of newspaper you put in there, then it's probably done. And that's typically good enough for an average gardener. Somebody wanting to take that to the next level, there's a test called a Solvita test out of Woods End in Massachusetts, and it's a respiration test. So it actually gives you a 1 to 10 scale, and I can't remember if 1 is finished or 10, but point being is it's like a litmus test almost. That's a bad analogy because pH is kind of fulcrumed on the neutral, but what it gives you is how much the life in the pile is breathing. And the more it's breathing, the less finished it is. Microbes have an ability to form cysts when they're done decomposing organic matter, and they have no more potential to work on, and they go dormant, and they can be shelf stable for a number of years, actually. Not the case with compost tea, because you've grown the population to such an extraordinary population that they don't have time to take a passive stability through cessation, and what you get there is a lot of die-off, like putting 1,000 people in a sealed room. They don't have the ability to set up a way for them to breathe in the future. Maybe not that we would otherwise. We're not microbes and can't make cysts. Again, if anybody knows that that's the case, let me know. So the point is, you've got very legitimate inputs. Anything that was once alive can be composted. We'll go through some do's and don'ts towards the end here. And, through that process, the microbes work on it to create humus that then is in a position to be built back up by living systems. And that loop is what we're looking to reinforce in regenerative bioenergetic agriculture. So just some thoughts before getting into some of the detail. Composting is the act of making humus, leveraging the ability of microbes to do that. It is a passive process in that it takes place independently of us needing to push it forward, which is a good thing. We want more of that on our farms. We want, any of you out there that are farmers know that very well. The less that you have to do, the more gets done. So, microbes are the best teammate in the world. So composting is a very simple way to not only develop that teamwork infrastructure, but to get some free fertilizer and free plant food out of the process. That builds your soil while you're at it. So, reference the idea that all of nature is a compost pile and should be at this point. Anything that's not is a very anthropocentric breadcrumb there. We create our own issues. So the only really conscious parts to composting, and I just kind of wanted to walk through some of the metrics that are kind of frequently asked questions in regards to evaluating compost, but the only conscious parts are, did we inoculate the organic matter so that the process can actually happen to begin with? and what's called the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which sounds technical, but we'll break that down. So to inoculate, we've talked about a little bit of this already, but there's a lot of compost accelerators on the market. You can buy them at the hardware store. Next time you're there, if you think about it, run through the garden section and just read the label and note that there's probably 5 to 10 microbes in the product. It doesn't mean that those 5 to 10 microbes aren't involved in the composting process, but when you understand the level of diversity in a natural system, it becomes very obvious that it's limited. There should be that number of species of nematodes in a good sample of product alone, not to mention the thousands of known strains of bacteria, etc. So, to expect the food web to be complete in any form with typical inoculants is part of the issue that people experience when they compost. So diversity wins the day every single time. And, if you're not in the market for an inoculant, such as I've described that we make, for example, you can, go scratch the forest floor, go get 10 of your friends or even one of them's compost and add it to yours. The most you'll get out of composting 101 from the general posture of the market, in my experience, is add a good cup of garden soil to your compost bin. And the mindset there is that the microbes are in that soil and you're adding them to the pile. Unfortunately, they don't name any names. They don't paint a picture to stimulate the imagination of what's actually happening. And the problem in the end that's most important is the garden soil is probably dead to begin with, right? So that just results in us spinning our wheels in ignorance. We don't really even know why we're having the issues that we don't know about. So this is really, in my experience, the source of most confusion. If you inoculate it consciously, you can tick that box and you don't have to consider whether those microbes are present for you or not. So there's a number of different methods of composting. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of technical time working through them. They're all a different way to the same place. All of them can be evaluated in your application in positive and some in negative ways, to give you an idea. A lot of like, sheet composting, which, would be covering the garden area with cardboard or wood chips or something like that. It makes a ton of sense, but you're back to that inoculation conversation. Does the soil have in it what's required for it to break that down in a positive agricultural way? And a lot of times it's deficient. So, again, if you've covered the inoculation base, nothing wrong there. What you see in that image right there is the biodynamic preparation of BD 500. That's cow manure buried in the earth in these horns that focus the energy through the winter seasons, when all of the energy is in the earth. And it potentizes, is the word that we use, and creates a higher level of efficacy and relevance in the vibration of the material that can be imprinted into water and then carried out into the field as a frequency. Literally frequency farming. Forget the physicality. And it's a very real thing for a lot of people out there. It does take some getting used to, people that haven't heard of it. But it's a bit of a cold composting process. Typically, when a product is evaluated from an organic growing standpoint, they're looking for the amount of heat that it's generated over an extended period of time, so as a sanitation process, which is understandable on some level. It's also not required to create good compost. In my experience, the best compost is not turned and is not heated. The compost that's made in my area is made in big warehouses on concrete floor. They bring turkey manure and pine bark in, and then they don't even know what microbes are. I know because I've asked them. They don't really want to know either, but to each his own. And what they're doing is steaming to generate the heat that they need, and they're turning, and what they're doing aggressively, and what they're doing is oxidizing the organic matter. They make it look the part, but it's really no better than high-end mulch, and with some soluble fertilizer mixed through it from the urea and what's ever soluble from the manures. And so it's enough to give a boost to the growth initially, but the next season everything's falling apart because there's no engine in the soil to make more of it. So that was something that became very real for me over the years in progressive gardens. People would go buy the cheap $50 a yard compost, and absolutely go do that at the price point, but make sure that you're inoculating with something that can actually make that into what you expect it to be. Otherwise, you're going to be sorely disappointed in the results. So, again, won't go too much into some of these methods. If anybody has any comments or, things that have worked for you or questions about this, absolutely bring it up. So the result is of composting is humus. You can see the surface area of humus is extraordinary. A teaspoon is the electrical surface area of a football field. It's kind of hard to imagine. And I've used the concept of jelly pockets in the past. That was a term I took from Alexander Podolinsky. He was a biodynamic farmer in Australia. And he paints the picture of the jelly pockets in the soil and the water surrounding everywhere else. And, when the clouds come through and cover the sun, the plant can choose to drink more than eat. When the sun comes back out, it can eat and drink. And it has a choice to make in a good way. It gives it an opportunity to grow within itself in the way that it wants. And you can make an easy jump to understanding what happens to plants when you've solubilized fertilizer throughout the entire water table. The plant may grow bigger, but it's obese, right? And that's going to attract pests and diseases and disrupt the balance of the living system in a way that most of us just aren't aware of from an agricultural level, but that's relevant. So I always find that description is helpful for people. So talk through some of this is kind of as technical as you'll get with composting, I think. You can see the steam coming off this pile. That's the activity of the microbes within. That doesn't come from ambient heat. People ask a lot, should my compost pile be in the sun? It doesn't need to be. It could be steaming in your basement in the winter if you wanted it to. As long as it's inoculated and the pile's within a 3x3 volume, you've got the ability to generate the type of heat in the center of the pile that should create the steam and give you that visual influence there. So temperature is typically not something that you have to monitor or measure. Doesn't hurt to look at it, but I usually just recommend people do the field test, and I do this a lot with our compost tea. If you're not getting a result out of your composting, and we talk about the carbon and nitrogen, which we'll talk about in a minute, and you're feeling the pile, nothing's happening, you can add the living organisms from the tea, go back even within an hour later, and you can feel the difference in the heat coming off the pile. Again, that's simply just a matter of the raw frictional activity of the microbes, if that's easier to think about. Not sure that friction works on that level or not, but it's a life force nonetheless. So, you want temperatures that are higher simply because that's conducive to aerobic decomposition, which is what we're encouraging. It does slow in colder weather, but it doesn't stop. But again, this is not something that you need to create the conditions for. If the pile's properly inoculated, this tends to take care of itself. Same with aeration. This is probably the highest level of focus people bring. Well, I turn it every week. Some people are turning it every day because nothing's happening, and you can actually turn compost too much. It disrupts the heat and the level of organization the pile's looking for. So it is somewhat ironic that the best compost that I've ever experienced is not turned. Biodynamic compost is typically, what I showed you with the horn manure is a way of making the preparation, but biodynamics, the preparations, there's 9 of them, and they were 7 of them. 6 of them were articulated in order to make compost. So you're impregnating the compost pile with very deliberate plants and herbs that have been potentized in their own unique way that create a force field for the microbes to be able to work within. And it catalyzes their activity. And you don't turn the pile. It might take 4 to 6 months to make some biodynamic compost that you could do in 6 to 8 weeks if you turned it aggressively. So, good things do come to those who wait. In that respect, that does hold true with composting. And, I referenced it in the Earth compound video, but the idea of really challenging the microbe and not providing like really cush conditions for them, right? It's like if you wait on your kid till they're 30 hand and foot, they're not going to be very accomplished. They're not going to have life experience is kind of the term that I like to use. So there's a term called facultative that says, basically nature has an ability to respond no matter what the conditions are and how they change. So, the same bacteria might be able to operate in an anaerobic fashion without air. Whereas when the pile is turned and more air comes in, it can operate aerobically or with air. And it has that ability to go back and forth in its life process, which is frankly quite amazing. And it makes sense that there's something like that there, because if conditions change drastically and everything that was there died, we'd have a hard time proliferating life on Earth over the millennia. So, that result of that static pile approach is that the microbe goes back and forth between, fermentation back to aerobic decomposition. And it's got more life experience, literally. Not unlike in a loose analogy, hardening off a plant. You got a plant in your living room and you put it out in a windstorm, well, it's going to get ripped to shreds. Versus, the clone plant that grew up outdoors is going to be able to be hardy towards it. And this hardening off is typically talked about in regards to temperature. So you do the same thing. You breed them out in the day, and you kind of get them acclimated to the different conditions that you're introducing them to, and they thrive because of it. So, you know, microbes in a loose way of describing them are a lot in the same way. You really don't want to make it so ideal that they don't have that life experience. In concept, the challenge is how do we measure that, right? I always say, well, what if somebody was looking at us through a microscope and I'm a better trumpet player and you're a better soccer player? I mean, how would they know that, right? They're just looking at us as people. We might look the same, but we got completely different abilities. So, and you really kind of follow the thread of that general, qualitative conversation. Admittedly, I don't even know how to generate data points out of that other than how well they work on plants, which is, again, somewhat anecdotal, but it is relevant to consider as you're composting. Turning is typically, in my experience, mostly a compensation for a lack of inoculation to begin with, more so than a stated demand for the process itself. So I personally wouldn't turn a pile more than once a week if I was going to do it. I think twice a week is probably acceptable, but try to mitigate the turning and focus more on the biological and microbial diversity, and I think you'll see the success factor increase. So you can see there's kind of some rough data around temperature and how much it's being generated. Honestly, I should probably take this slide out because it appears to me that, couple liabilities. One is that I don't know if they inoculated to get this data. The second being temperature doesn't define biological decomposition in and of itself. It's kind of like people that evaluate compost tea on whether it foams or not. Foam can be an indirect indication of biological activity because it's protein cycling, but you can absolutely brew a completely vital tea that doesn't foam. So, it's never black and white. We got to use our discernment in that regard. So moisture is something that comes up quite a bit. You want that 40 to 60 range, kind of like a wrung out sponge, 50% being the average there. Not unlike what you'd want to see in a potting soil or, an engineered growing mix that you made. Typically, you don't have to measure the moisture. If the pile is inoculated and the structure of the compost and the humus can be influenced by diverse microbes, it should drain exactly the way that it needs to, and it should retain as much water as it needs to. This is not something that really needs to be managed from a human posture. A lot of that type of approach has to do with the fact that there was no focus on the microbes to begin with. So my, MO is always to make sure that the microbes are there before we start trying to troubleshoot what the problems are. And most of the time, most of the issues are gone before we even need to talk about them. So, people ask, well, should I water my compost? Does it matter if it rains on it? I mean, the answer is yes and no. No, you don't have to water your compost unless you've got it contained in a way in which the moisture can't reach it well enough. And a lot of times the nitrogen influence, the fresh material that you're putting into a pile contains enough moisture for it to moisturize the pile. So it's, typically I get the question the other way around is, should it rain on my compost? Because when it does, it soaks the pile. Well, that's probably because their nitrogen is a lot higher than relative to their carbon, which we'll talk to about in a minute. So typically, this is a factor to think about, but it's not something that creates any sort of action, in my opinion. The size of the input is something that can influence the speed of which the compost finishes decomposing. Simple, the more surface area there is for the microbes to engage, the faster they can do their work. The more potential there is and food source for the microbes in the pile. So that simply means instead of throwing the whole section of the newsprint paper in the pile, shred it up. Instead of throwing the whole envelope in there, put it through a paper shredder. And just if you're conscious of that, all it's really going to do, it's not going to define success. It's just going to speed the process up to finish sooner. So that's pretty straightforward. And then, the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So to simplify this, you want a 2-to-1 by volume carbon to nitrogen. And the way to think about carbon is anything aged. The way to think about nitrogen is anything fresh. If you think about, our air that we breathe is about 80%, almost 80% nitrogen. Fresh things have nitrogen. I always make this point, to talk about it from that standpoint. It's leaves or paper is all aged material. So it's got a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio. Fresh things have a lower one. So if you do the 2-to-1 by volume carbon to nitrogen, you end up in a loose posture of what the microbe wants to eat in order for the energy, which is used. Carbon is used as energy for microbes, and nitrogen is used for the reproductive capacity. So you can imagine if you got all the energy capacity in the world, but not enough reproductive, the pile is limited. If you reverse that and they can reproduce, but they can't eat, the pile is limited. So this is a bit like making a buffet without, steak being the only offering, if you will. You need a balanced diet for your microbes. So don't measure things. This is more of a influence. It's not about like literal volumes of this stuff. I give you an anecdote. On my porch and my compost bin, what goes in is food waste, which is typically nitrogen based for the sake of the discussion. So if I'm putting food waste into the compost pile over time, and then I don't put the paper shredder in there once every 2, 3, 4 weeks, I'll get, the heat will slow down. I may get some odors. The pile's anaerobic on some level, and it's simply just waterlogged relative to the lack of carbon in the pile. So when I put the paper shredder material into the pile, mix it up accordingly, the smells go away in a very short period of time, and the heat comes back and the process ensues. So you never really go too far down a road that you can't correct. Don't feel like you've spoiled the compost or anything like that. So my experience is once you get the rhythm of what you need to do to avoid those types of things, it's kind of second nature. It's not something that you have to put a whole lot of direct energy into. You just want to be aware that you can't just put whatever you want in a pile and have it break down the way that you want. You have to keep the microbes in mind. So you can see, this is kind of a data set of how, again, they're using temperature, which is not the best metric, but it is correct to say that a properly balanced pile is going to break down quicker than one that's not, simply because the microbes are able to do their work. So, an easy way to describe the carbon and nitrogen thing is like a fresh pile of grass. It's green. After a week or so, it turns brown and off gases all its nitrogen. This is the equivalent of a lot of the compost that's sold on the open market. It's aged manure. So it's no longer hot. It's not going to burn your plants when you use it. But a lot of the potential of what makes that a valuable substance has been lost to the air. A lot of the fertilizer potential of the nitrogen in these manures is gone. And the reality is they haven't taken that manure through the soil microbe decomposition process. They did it through the gut process, right? So that material does have some soluble relevance to grow plants from, which is why manure is used and sold on the market in such volume. But we're not getting nowhere near the value out of that manure as if we had taken it through an actual soil microbe composting process and retained all that nitrogen that we would have lost to carbon molecules in the pile. So we're value adding our composting process, and we're inoculating our gardens with the activity that the microbes are undertaking in the composting. You can win in 10 other ways doing that as well. So again, typically things that are aged are more carbon, and fresh is more nitrogen. There's always an anomaly. Coffee grounds are, I guess you could say, more fresh, but they are nitrogen based and they're brown. So, I guess you could say they're aged too, but the point is that they're nitrogen based and they're brown. So it's never, agriculture is never an exact science. So, keep those things in mind, and that way it can kind of help you guide some of the way in which you're creating your process. So the carbons, they're the age, the nitrogens are the greens. Again, they're the coffee grounds anomaly. Trust that makes sense. The nitrogen is going to be more fresh, carbon's more age. So that 2-to-1 by volume is really a big takeaway. And then here's a list of some do's and don'ts. You'll be able to access this presentation. I'll send a PDF, and particularly if you've engaged us on the $29 a year support, you'll have unlimited access to this information and to me. So again, appreciate everybody's support out there. So, some of the don'ts that I'll take a second on: meats, they will decompose. You're going to get more odors out of them. You're going to attract some rodents, things like that you may not want to have to deal with. Cheeses, oils, cooked foods, things like that are more that cooked material. It doesn't really define the potential to microbes that raw material does, which is a lot of the credence for a raw diet. We're cooking out, even though we're value adding the flavor and all those good things, we are cooking out a lot of the relevance of the health potential of the food. So there's a reason that, moldy, white bread doesn't mold on a counter, right? If the microbes don't want to eat it, probably shouldn't either. But having said that, the reason you don't add it is that the potential for biological decomposition has been cooked out of it. So you kind of want to avoid anything that's been cooked. A little bit of that's not going to harm anything. It's just don't make it a primary input in your pile. Bones are kind of obvious. They're just, it's going to take, you know, many years, more than our lifetimes to break down. So just steer clear of it. You won't have to filter it out on the back end. Same with large sticks. Pine needles a little bit as well. They've got a waxy cuticle on them that prevents them from being a little bit broken down effectively, in my experience. Wood ash is more of a chemical thing. You know, there is some benefit to stimulating biological activity through ashes, which makes sense in how one of the ways in which nature regenerates itself is when a forest burns down, it can be catalyzed to be built back up. But what you get with ash is a really concentrated and high amount of specific mineral elements like potassium, and sometimes they can be trace elements that you don't need a lot of at all that are brought in a much higher concentration that can actually affect your agronomy. So I tend to discourage ash being used in composting unless it's a small input that, you know, you can kind of dilute out through your process. But this is kind of the realm of biochar. You know, there's actually science that goes into how to create the charcoal and at what temperatures and length of exposure and things like that, to whether you get to a complete ash or whether you get to a charred charcoal that is admittedly a very good environment for microbes to work within. But you just want to make sure that you're doing the process based on the way that you think you're doing it. I guess is the best way I could describe that. So, you know, there's probably a more pervasive list somewhere, but this should get the point across. You know, anything that was once alive and is no longer can be broken down into humus. Many of the things that are cooked or processed in any sort of way or resist the decomposition process should be avoided. And that'll make you a happier composter. So, you know, again, this is kind of a 3 weeks out from processed bread versus fresh bread, which, you know, should give you some insight into the quality of our diets in the modern world. Go look into the book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston Price. It's kind of an aside completely because he wasn't a microbial guy, but it'll give you some insight into how we're our own worst enemy, unfortunately. So take that into account. I had a video here, I believe. Let me see if it'll come up. Yeah, so check this. This is kind of an extreme, but wow, check this out. So McDonald's over time, and all it's doing is dehydrating. You know, again, it's a pretty safe filter in our diets that if microbes don't want to eat it, we probably shouldn't either. And this is just some evidence of that. It's pretty remarkable, actually. You can see it getting smaller, but it is not changing. So wow on that. We could go another 30 seconds, but it's going to look the same at the end. So pretty unbelievable. So, you know, keep microbes front and center. This is a flow chart that I won't go through line by line, but that I kind of put together based on frequently asked questions and, you know, issues based, you know, solution based consulting. It's always the goal is to deliver solutions, not more problems or more questions. So, you know, there's never a straight line. You know, if you're not getting, if you have odors, it's a sign of anaerobic decomposition. It's kind of like why the marsh smells when you drop by it at low tide. There's too much moisture in there for aerobic decomposition. The anaerobic can introduce sulfurs and different pathways of decomposition that create these odors. Typically, that means you've got too much nitrogen in your pile. The moisture level is too high. The process has to be undertaken anaerobically. So, you know, that's one way of looking at it. You could also be using inputs that you don't want to use, like meats, for example. So, you know, there's always a reason. This is a very deliberate process that feels like it has a lot of nuance to it, but it's really not as complicated as it can seem. As long as the micro players are involved and the conditions are within a reasonable range, you should have every expectation to have a really positive experience composting. So I mentioned this earlier and I just highlight it again. You know, it can take a lot of effort to make the amount of compost a farmer is going to need on their own farm. Typically, if somebody's looking for compost, they're outsourcing that. Most of the bulk of compost sold in the United States is sold from animal operations that frankly have a really high level of liability in regards to the manure that they collect and accumulate, and they don't know what to do with it. This happens in Florida at racetracks all the time, and they have no FOSS legislations, and they have to pay millions of dollars to manage their waste stream. So there's a lot of companies that are looking at how to create a profit center out of that, and they should be, frankly. I've done some R&D for a horse stall bedding company that was looking to turn spec'd out boxes from industry that no longer made sense, and they bought the boxes penny on the dollar and then shredded it up, added some zeolites, which retains more of the urea waste stream in the material, and we added I think I might go through it here in a couple of weeks in the second compost tea, but we added the control had nothing, just the bedding material and the manure and the waste stream in one pile, and we added microbes passively to the second and did the same on the third, but sprayed the pile with compost tea, and the difference in the microbial spectrums and the rate at which they decomposed was out of this world. So that was the 15 years ago. That was the first time I ever saw microbes work on paper, if you will. And that's an important place to get to, because it really generates the sort of authority that we've come to expect in the analytical world that we live in. And I've since seen microbes do just incredible things. But buying compost on the market is mostly just buying the name. It's a very easy word to say. The majority of compost sold in the United States is not compost. It is animal manure, aged animal manure, like black cow you see at the hardware store, at a big box store. The reason it's $1 a bag is because there's really no effort at all undertaken in creating a value-added product. They just simply let the manure age and put it in the bag. And in a lot of cases, it's sanitized. It's steamed or it's pasteurized in some way that defeats the purpose of microbes to begin with, right? So it's just basically raw organic matter, like the leaves that fell in a forest, that value added. So again, we'll reinforce the fact that I'm picking on that, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't buy it. It's also very cheap by volume. You can get a yard of, looking the part compost in my town for $50, 75 delivered. And if you're setting up raised beds in your landscape, or you need bulk compost for your farm, nothing wrong with that price point, right? But you need to make sure to be able to intellectualize the fact that you need to bring the soil microbes to break that material down to any sort of true value. And if we're not aware of that, we run into those walls of, it worked okay first year, but next year there's nothing there, and you're doing it all over again, and you're paying more than you should in spades. So, an easy metric if you're buying compost is just ask the formulator what they use biologically, or what do you know about soil food web, or give them some softball and just see if they have the wherewithal to answer the question. And honestly, if they can answer the question, they're probably making a much better product than somebody who doesn't know what you're talking about. And if they look at you funny, that should tell you everything. And you may want to talk them down on the price because you know more than them if you want, but the bottom line is just buy it knowing that you need to bring the construction workers, and that'll allow you to generate your price point and have the success that you should expect. So just keep that in mind when you're on the market for compost. This is just a couple images of composting. As we wrap up here, people want to compost in their kitchen, and there's these bokashi and anaerobic digesters that you can put in your kitchen that are pretty cool. I've never actually used one. I imagine it does, there's a lot of them that are popular for animal waste, dog waste as well. And the anaerobic process is really just to mitigate the odors and to cycle the nutrients through. But anaerobic organisms as a product typically aren't part of the food web. The food web is mostly derived of aerobic organisms. So, again, you can kind of see the nuance here. Are you composting? Well, yeah, but you're doing it anaerobically. And these kitchen composters, typically, they don't finish the process. That, if you buy one with the, is really doing its job, it's got a carbon filter to prevent the odors. And this just means you got to go out to the compost pile once every couple days to a week rather than every time you finish a meal. It's a convenience. It's not really performing anything else other than that. You can buy composters like this one. I've got this brand. Nothing wrong with it. Nothing really to write home about either. Composting is a process, not a product. So a lot of people used to walk into our garden store and say, well, look, I have to get a composter if I'm going to compost. And we talk 50% of them out of it. Look, you don't need a compost bin to do composting. You just need a pile on the ground. the people that bought them had a homeowners association, or, you know, had some bylaw that they wanted to keep their dog out of it or something like that. And it can speed the process up. It can collect your moisture as an extract on the bottom. Other than that, they're really just making it a little more convenient to turn, which, as we've discussed, is not as important as people might imagine. A lot of people build their own piles. You know, these kind of make sense where, you know, question comes up a lot. Well, I've got the organic matter is broken down and I've got one compost pile and I want to add some more to it, but then I don't know how to separate it. Well, you know, just take one more step towards the process and create some scenarios that you can add to as overflow. You know, in my bin, when I filled it up, I'd let the whole thing finish, and in the meantime, I'd just take the rest to the corner of the yard. And then sometimes when I'm really looking to be aggressive, I'd take some of that material and put it in the bin to finish it quicker, you know. So you can kind of work your process out. But, you know, in the end, if you're adding some fresh material to your garden, as long as it's not a high amount of volume, there shouldn't be any issue for that. The one thing that can rear its head that I actually haven't experienced a whole lot, but in concept makes sense, if you're adding a bunch of aged material, carbon, that's fresh to your garden, like in the form of a mulch, for example. If the soil environment and you're not fertilizing to compensate, the microbes can consume some of the nitrogen that would be available to finish the decomposition process, and it can create deficiencies easily overcome with fertilizers, and people are typically using them anyway. But I guess it's worthy of some discussion. And, you know, we looked at this earlier. Again, this is the energy of the pile. You know, this pile is alive, and we really need to treat it as such. And when we do, we bring all kinds of residual benefit. You know, vermicomposting is something that's pretty popular. I do it at home. It kind of cuts through the technicality of carbon to nitrogen a little bit. The worms tend to fire through all of that and kind of streamline the process for us a little bit relative to the hands-on approach of composting. But, you know, compost piles should have worms in them. So if you don't have worms in your compost, go find some and put them in there. You'll be happy you did. It definitely value adds the process. So that was it's the brunt of what I wanted to get across for composting 101 here. Bottom line is just do it. It's, you know, hopefully some of the information I've delivered today can mitigate some of the responsibility you feel towards it. It's not something you need to actively manage. Microbes make compost, no way around that. And the power of the microbial realm is based off of diversity. So just access as many diverse sources as inoculants as you can, and it's going to make your inoculant on the other end of your composting process more valuable, and you can get to making compost tea out of that. And we can talk about that over the next couple of weeks.